Welcome to the first video on the channel. My team Leeds United got relegated last season from the Premier League, mainly due to poor owners, poor running of the club. And it had me looking at many of the other Premier League teams in awe. Brighton were a key example of this, rising from League One all the way to the European spots. So I wanted to deep dive in, have a real good look at Brighton as a club and what they've done and how they've managed to achieve this in comparison to my team who are now back in the Championship. So join me today as we deep dive into Brighton's history and how they've managed to make it into the top 6 of the Premier League. If you'd have told Brighton fans in 2010, as they sat 13th in League One, that they'd now be sharing a European stage with some massive names such as Liverpool, Roma, Real Betis and a load more, never mind the fact they're finishing in the top 6 in the Premier League, they'd have snapped your hand off. But the question is, how did they get to this point? Brighton's rise to the top has been no coincidence. Back in 2009, they were taken over by Tony Bloom, a local man whose family had been involved in the club and he'd made millions playing poker, becoming an entrepreneur, etc. One of his first investments really showed his long-term ambitions for the club. This was the £93 million investment in the Amex Stadium, the stadium that Brighton still play in to this day, one that hosted the Women's World Cup and is probably going to host many more things in the future. This was a move that fans definitely welcomed. It was a move away from the old stadium, which was called the With Dean Stadium, which in 2004 was ranked the 4th worst football stadium in the whole of the UK. This was just the start of Tony's reign at Brighton. In the next few seasons, sitting in the Championship, they managed to get in the playoffs 3 times out of 4 seasons. Unfortunately, they crashed out the playoffs every time, which I'm sure was heartbreaking for fans, but they could really see the ambitions of Tony and what he was trying to do for the club. The final season in the Championship was a very impressive one. They started the season on an 18-game unbeaten streak, which if anyone watches the Championship, and I'm sure most people that are watching this do, they'll know that it's one of the toughest leagues in the world. After an 18-game unbeaten streak, things dropped off a little bit, but Brighton still managed to secure automatic promotion in 2nd place, 8 points above their nearest competitor in Reading, who finished 3rd. And they actually came up that season with Newcastle, who won the league. Newcastle have had a very different journey to the position they're in the Premier League now, obviously above Brighton and finally getting Champions League football, which we do love to see for Newcastle fans. But that's more due to recent investment instead of long-term strategies. Anyway, let's get on to Brighton's Premier League rise and what happened once they'd managed to get to the promised land. Since joining the Premier League, I think everyone can see that Brighton have gone from strength to strength. They're one of those teams that nobody wants their team to be playing that weekend. You might think you'll get a few points, but you know if the right Brighton team shows up, then it's game over. I think the recruitment of both staff and players and what they've done to keep players, not let go of them too easily and not give in to players' demands and waited for the right price has been some of the key things that have kept Brighton in the Premier League. But I wanted to jump into a few things. The first one is young player recruitment. I don't believe there's many teams in the Premier League that have done a better job than Brighton have with getting good young talent at respectable prices into the club. The first example of this I want to bring up is someone from Chelsea's academy. I feel like every team has someone from Chelsea's academy at this point, but that is Tariq Lamptey, who joined in the 2019-2020 season from Chelsea for only £1.2 million. Now when you look back at that transfer, it seems pretty unbelievable. Lamptey's probably already worth 15-20 million. I mean, I'll let you be the judge of that, but given he's an English player, a fullback, and already a pretty reliable fullback, I'd say that his value is pretty high. So if Brighton were to sell, that would be a key example of a good player. Even if they don't sell, already a good Premier League proven player that they can start game in, game out. The next example I want to talk about is Alexis McAllister, a man we've all just seen have an amazing season, win the World Cup. But when he joined Brighton at just 20 years old, it was for a relatively small fee of £8 million. Bear in mind, this is a lot of money in comparison to some of the lower league clubs, but when we're talking about the Premier League, it seems like a pittance. So after joining Brighton at 20 years old, he went on loan to a team called Argentinos Juniors, not sure if I've got that right, and Boca Juniors. Alexis didn't start playing for Brighton until the 2020-21 season, so that really wasn't that long ago. He's had 2 full seasons there playing Premier League football, and we've all just seen Alexis get that big money move to Liverpool, which has cost them £45 million, a price which we all think he's pretty respectable, pretty reasonable. But that means within just a short few seasons, Brighton have managed to pick up £37 million in profit. The perfect strategy in terms of picking him up from Argentina, then sending him back out on loan there, making sure he's comfortable, and then starting him in the Premier League, getting him that World Cup spot which made him shine so brightly, and then taking advantage of what you've done and recouping £37 million in profit from Liverpool. Another example of a young player nurtured by Brighton, and one that is very close to my heart, is Ben White. Ben White was a Brighton Academy prospect who kind of learned his trade on the road. He was at Peterborough on loan, and then he came to Leeds United on loan, and for us, he was a fantastic centre-back. Leeds even put in, I believe it was a £35 million bid, which Brighton refused. But at Leeds, he was our young player of the season in the season that we got promoted from the Championship. So again, a really good choice, starting off at League One with Peterborough and then sending him up to Leeds, a team that has a lot of pressure. When you're playing at Ellen Road, you know, the crowd's always on your back. So it's a good team for a young player to go on loan to. And then refusing the bid from Leeds, which at the time may have seemed like a silly idea. £35 million for a player who had yet to prove himself in the Premier League. But Brighton kept a hold of him, played him for a full season, and then they managed to pick up £58 million for White from Arsenal. He's now an Arsenal regular. I think he would be getting in the England squad, but there's something not quite right there. But anyway, they waited an extra season, got an extra £20 million. Fantastic choice from the club. This last one I've got, I think, is the biggest example of Brighton doing amazingly well with a transfer strategy, and that is Marc Cucurella. Now, when we look at it and look at his performances at Chelsea, it seems like the steal of a lifetime getting the fee that they did for him. But to be honest, at the time, Marc had a fantastic season, and the move to Chelsea didn't really surprise anyone. I thought the fee was a little bit high, but I didn't think it was anything too extortionate at the time. Brighton picked up Cucurella for just £18 million, played him for a season in the Premier League. He proved himself at the time as a Premier League player, and then sold him the next summer for £70 million. That means they made £52 million in profit just over one summer. Tell me what, I barely ever see transfers like that in the Premier League. There's a few more examples of this. I don't want to jump into every single one, but I think they're four of the best examples of Brighton picking up players on the cheap or even developing them themselves and then selling them for a massive profit. Obviously, every Premier League team has a few of these players. Every team around the world has a few of these players. But I think it really shows the transfer strategy, and especially because for each of these players, they've managed to get such a high fee. When I've been looking through the past transfers, there's a couple of examples where they've sold players for a little bit less than they're probably worth now. But in all of these situations, they've held out and made the big teams pay the big bucks for the players. And that's something a lot of smaller teams fall victim to. Once one of the top six comes knocking and the player's interested, they're out the door. You've seen it in January with still, for now, current Brighton player Moises Caicedo. I don't know how long he's going to be at the club, but they chose not to sell him in January, despite him putting out statements to the contrary. And now they're likely going to pick up a massive fee if he is to leave this summer. That isn't the only area in which I think Brighton do well with the squad and how they arrange things in the transfer market. The next one is experience for free. I don't mean this particularly free. Obviously, you've got to pay players' wages, and I'm sure some of these had signing fees, etc., etc. But I've got a few examples of times where Brighton have picked up experienced Premier League players and generally experienced Premier League winners, players who are capable of winning trophies and know what it's like to lead in a team, bringing them into the team, which will perfectly feed into bringing these young players up, some of the ones we just went over. But anyway, let me jump into the first one. Not a world beater, but a good, proven Premier League player, and that is Danny Welbeck. So Danny Welbeck joined the team, having had experience at Manchester United, at Arsenal. He'd technically won the league, won the Champions League, had appearances in all of those. He was at Watford when Brighton picked him up. Well, his contract had run out at Watford when Brighton picked him up. But he is a player that had 50 Premier League goals before he even joined the club. So to get someone like that on a free, and at the time, I think he was like 28, 29 years old, is a really smart purchase. Welbeck hasn't set the world alight at Brighton, but I don't think when they signed him, they'll have been expecting that. They'll have wanted a player there to play alongside Neil Maupay at the time, who's been the top scorer for a couple of seasons. Welbeck's picked up a steady 18 goals and 10 assists, which... it's not amazing, admittedly, but for a free transfer and someone that's going to bring the squad up, it's a pretty smart signing, in my opinion. The next example of this, similar to Danny Welbeck, another proven winner, is Adam Lallana from Liverpool. Lallana is a Premier League and Champions League winner who'd played in a Liverpool team revitalised that had managed to do some amazing things. So picking him up on a free transfer, again, a little bit injury prone, but it's worth taking the risk if you're getting someone on a free transfer. He may not have had many goals and assists since joining Brighton, but he has had 70 appearances for the club. So he's clearly a very important part of the squad and an important part of what they're doing. And the last example I've got for this is a man we're yet to see what he's going to do, but it's another Liverpool import in James Milner. James Milner's a proven leader. He's been the captain at Liverpool. He's played in Champions League finals. He's played at Manchester City. He's won everything there is to win in England and played for some of the biggest clubs in the country. I really do think Milner will be a fantastic addition to Brighton. He's definitely still got enough in him and the fitness levels to play in the Premier League. Again, helping to bring up those younger players so they can keep getting those huge fees for them. So those are the two main ways that I think Brighton are different to other Premier League clubs. I really like the way that Brighton have done things, and it's different to see a team get into the top 6 without absolutely bursting the bank. Of course, you can talk about Aston Villa, who have done really well this season, but they've got some of the richest owners in the Premier League, and they've spent a lot of money still to get in the position they're in now. Well, what's next for Brighton? If I was a Brighton fan, I'd be really excited. As a Brighton fan, the opportunity to go see European nights at the Amex is class. I think they'll continue to make strides forward. I'm not sure they're going to become a club that are consistently in the top 6. I think that's really difficult to do, especially with the strategy that they have of picking up these young players. Sometimes it's going to take a couple of years before they're up to speed, before they're ready to challenge some of those top 6 teams. The added revenue they'll get and the added exposure they'll get from European football should mean that things keep on ticking over and they can continue with the strategy. However, I would definitely predict that next season they'll be in and around the top 7. I'm not sure whereabouts they'll be. Obviously, you've got Chelsea that might manage to creep back up there again. We're going to have to wait and see who they sign in this window because it's just been a mass exodus so far. Tottenham have the players to creep back up there, as their Aston Villa are going to be up there. In other words, there's a lot of teams that are going to be challenging for those top spots in the Premier League. But if I was a Brighton fan, from League One in 2010 to now finishing 6th in the Premier League, above teams such as Tottenham and Chelsea, is such an unbelievable journey. I would be over the moon. Anyway, that was the first video on the channel. I hope you enjoyed that little deep dive into Brighton, some of the transfers they've made, some of the decisions they've made over the years, which have clearly paid off well. I actually don't have a name for the channel yet. It might just be my name, so you'll be seeing it before me, but drop it a like, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you soon with some more football content. Peace.